Hey, my name is Dave from Meadow City Nursery, and I'd like to welcome you to Pollinator Town. So Pollinator Town is just a way of thinking about our gardens as places of shelter and nesting habitat for pollinators and other beneficial insects. We know that our gardens provide food for these organisms in the form of pollen and nectar from our flowers. But now we're actually talking about giving these organisms a place to live in our gardens. And this is really the best situation for them because lots of pollinators have very short foraging ranges. So bees, for instance, lots of bees will do the majority of their foraging just within several hundred feet of their nest. So if we create nesting sites in our gardens, that's like putting food at the bee's doorstep where it's going to serve them best. And this is going to make our gardens much more lively, interesting places. Older, established gardens that have nesting sites often have 3 to 4 times as much pollinator activity as newer gardens where those pollinators aren't nesting. And we need to recognize that now is a critical time to help out our pollinators. In the state of Ohio, since the mid-90s, there has been a 33% decrease in butterfly abundance. That's 1 out of every 3 butterflies gone. And throughout North America, 26% of our bumblebee species are threatened with extinction. So if we can create shelter and nesting sites in our gardens, it'll go a long way to helping these species out. So why don't you come with me and we'll visit some of the neighborhoods of Pollinator Town. All right, so here's our first stop in Pollinator Town, and this is called Leafy Lane. And Leafy Lane is just an area of fallen leaves in our gardens. So lots of folks are used to using wood chip mulch in their gardens as a ground cover. But really what we should be using is fallen leaves. And this is because there are many beneficial insects that use fallen leaves as their shelter. So you have butterflies, moths, lacewings, hoverflies, lightning bugs, and the list goes on of beneficial insects that are finding shelter underneath the leaves. Caterpillars, lots of caterpillars will form their cocoons underneath the leaves. And moths and butterflies will actually spend the winter underneath the leaves. Now, depending on the species, they'll do this at different stages in their life cycle. What I have pictured here, for instance, is the Isabella tiger moth. Now, this moth will spend the winter under the leaves when it's in its caterpillar stage. And this is actually the most famous caterpillar in North America. It's the woolly bear. It's a black and tan fuzzy caterpillar, and maybe you've seen this before in the fall. They will be crawling across sidewalks and paths and walkways, and what they're doing is they're trying to find a patch of leaves so they can curl up under there and spend the winter. Now, the woolly bear actually has some amazing adaptations to be able to survive the winter cold. It's able to actually expel water out of its cells into the space between the cells so that when that water freezes and expands, the cells don't rupture. This means that the woolly bear can actually be frozen solid and then thawed out, and it's perfectly fine. And this will sometimes happen multiple times in the course of the winter with freeze-thaw cycles. But definitely the woolly bear is depending on the shelter of those leaves during the winter time, and there are lots of other organisms that are doing the same thing. Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to our next stop in Pollinator Town. All right, so here we have fallen timbers. And fallen timbers is just one or more pieces of decaying wood, like an old log. And what lives in fallen timbers? Beetles and bees. In fact, 30% of our bee species nest above ground in various cavities, and oftentimes these are going to be beetle burrows in dead wood. One of these bees I have pictured right here. This is the pure green sweat bee. This is a beautiful bee. It's bright green and shiny and metallic, and it's one of our most abundant bees in our forests. Some studies have found that the pure green sweat bee accounts for as much as 90% of the bees in our forests. However, the pure green sweat bee commonly goes outside of the forests into our yards and gardens. And when it's there, it's pollinating a whole variety of flowers. Asters, goldenrods, sunflowers, yarrow, you name it. And when it's looking for a place to nest, it's looking for a log in a shady, moist location. What it will do is it will enter the log through a pre-existing beetle burrow. Once it gets in there, it chews into the wood and it enlarges the burrow, making protective chambers for its larvae. Now, one of the beetles that forms these burrows is the Betsy beetle. The Betsy beetle at first looks pretty frightening. This beetle can get up to 1.5 inches long, but I promise you, it is a very gentle, harmless creature. And the Betsy beetle actually performs a very important ecological role by breaking down large pieces of wood into small fragments that can be more easily decomposed. Now, the thing about the Betsy beetle is it has a fascinating social structure. It actually lives in family units where the adult beetles work together to raise the younger beetles. And when they're doing this, they communicate with one another by one of the most complex systems of auditory communication in the insect world. The Betsy beetle produces 17 different squeaks and squeals and sounds that are audible to the human ear, and these have different meanings for the beetles. So they're talking back and forth and raising their young, and this could be happening in your backyard if you have, just an old log in a cool, moist location. This is especially true if you live near a larger woodland. But you might be thinking, oh, what are the odds that one of these creatures is actually going to show up in my yard? Well, I'll tell you, just about 6 weeks ago, I was visiting some friends in Shaker Heights, and they had an old log in their backyard next to their patio. And this was a very shady backyard, and I took a close look at it, and there was the pure green sweat bee buzzing all around, going in and out of burrows. So it could certainly happen in your yard, and this is a great way and an easy way to attract these organisms. All right, great. Let's move on to the next stop in Pollinator Town. Okay, so here we are at Stem Hollow, and Stem Hollow just refers to hollow or pithy plant stems, which lots of bees will use as nesting sites. Now, these aren't stems of living wildflowers, but rather dead stems that have been cut or broken on top. And since they're cut or broken, the bee can burrow down into the stem and make protective chambers for its larvae. As you might expect, bigger bees like leafcutter bees are going to go for wider diameter stems. Oftentimes leafcutter bees will really like the old stems of cup plant. A smaller bee, such as the small carpenter bee that we have pictured here, might go for a narrower stem. And one of the favorite stems that the small carpenter bee nests in is the stem of wild bergamot, which is a really nice wildflower that I have pictured here. The small carpenter bee actually has some fascinating social behaviors. So lots of bees, after they build their nests, they seal it up and the mother just takes off, and she probably doesn't come back. In fact, she might not live much longer after that. But the small carpenter bee mom is different. She's very dedicated, and after she builds her nest, she will stay at the nest entrance and she'll guard it against parasites and predators. Another thing that she does is on a daily basis, she works her way down into those chambers where her larvae are maturing, and she cleans them and she grooms the larvae, and she's making sure that there's no fungal or bacterial contamination. Finally, when her firstborn daughter reaches maturity, she will actually send that daughter out on an errand to collect more pollen and nectar to bring it back to the stem so that the whole family can live out the winter. So really some complex behaviors for such a small organism, but it's a common bee, and you could have it nesting in your garden if you have these standing dead stems. So what you want to do is, after your wildflowers die back at the end of the year, go ahead and leave those stems standing throughout the winter time. There are birds that will use that as winter cover. But then in the springtime, maybe in March, just cut those old stems to 1 to 2 feet tall, and that's all you got to do. And that'll be the perfect kind of nesting site for the small carpenter bee and other bees. All right, great. Let's move on to the next stop in Pollinator Town. All right. Okay, cool. I think we're all here. So, this is Mud Dauber Manor, and this just refers to the nesting habitat of the mud dauber wasp. So, if you have a patch of consistently wet, muddy soil in your yard, it might be that mud dauber wasps are using that as nesting material. This is a long black and yellow wasp with a very narrow body, and it is a pollinator. It visits lots of flowers, Virginia clematis, common boneset, late boneset. These are some of its favorites, but in general, wasps like white flowers, and they like flowers that are very shallow because that means it's easily accessible nectar. Now, just like bees will visit flowers to obtain nectar, so will the wasp. However, bees also are collecting pollen to feed their young. The wasp isn't collecting pollen, rather it hunts spiders. So it's going to hunt spiders, and that's what it's going to feed to its larvae. So what the mother black and yellow mud dauber will do is she will collect mud, and she will build her nest on the side of a building, oftentimes a house, under maybe a protective overhang or eave. Then she will stock that nest with those spiders which she has paralyzed. She'll lay her eggs on the spiders, seal up the nest, and then she'll take off. So what this means is she's not remaining at the nest defending it, so there's really no situation in which there would be an aggressive confrontation. These wasps are very gentle, and there are hardly ever any kinds of adverse interactions with them. Now, once the mud dauber larvae have matured, they're going to exit that mud nest, and when they do, they leave these openings. It turns out that those old mud dauber nests are the perfect nesting environment for leafcutter bees, mason bees, and other cavity nesting bees. So as you can see, the mud dauber has some very positive ecological impacts. Not only is it pollinating the flowers that it visits, but it's forming these nests that will become home to cavity nesting bees. So I would recommend to you that if you have a patch of muddy soil, maybe next to a bird bath or a fountain or along a drainage ditch, just keep an eye on it. And if you see that mud daubers are visiting it, I would leave it alone. Same thing if you find a mud nest that basically just looks like a blob of mud on the side of your house, I would let that go too, because there's not going to be any aggressive confrontation, and it might be in the future home to some cavity nesting bees, which would be really cool. All right, great. Let's move on to the next stop.
You have to remember to put a screen over your furnace, your RV furnace, so the mud dauber doesn't go in there and build his nest inside the chamber where it ignites with your furnace won't start up.
There you go. You know what? This is very true. I've heard stories like this, and I've even heard that some like small engine planes have potentially crashed because mud daubers have gone in there and built their nest. So yeah, be aware of that, that if you have like, you know, a device that's sitting idle for a time and has some kind of cavity in there, the mud daubers could get in there. But otherwise, they're great neighbors.
It happened to me.
It happened to this film, yeah.
So they're harmless? Do they sting? Or you said they're not aggressive, so...
Honestly, I don't even think... I mean, they could potentially sting if they were to be handled roughly. However, their sting... I've read that the venom lacks the components that would cause any pain, so it's not even a painful sting, and they almost never sting. And I can tell you this for sure because we have mud daubers at the nursery. Because we're always watering the plants, there are certain spots that are quite muddy, and we're walking among the mud daubers and dragging our hose past the mud daubers. They just are totally oblivious to us.
Are these types of wasps the only ones that go into the mud dauber enclosure? Or
Yeah.
do other species of wasps go in there and invade?
I have not read about any other kinds of wasps occupying the old mud dauber nests. That is not to say that it doesn't happen, it's just that I'm not aware of it. But definitely these leaf cutter bees and mason bees occupy the old nests, and those are similarly solitary bees, so they're not aggressively defending their nests.
Things like that.
Okay. Now, you make a time.
All right, here we are at the next stop in Pollinator Town, and this is Beetle Rock. And Beetle Rock just consists of one or more rocks which provide shelter to ground beetles. So ground beetles are not pollinators. However, they have a very beneficial role in the garden because they are predators of garden pests, specifically aphids, snails, and slugs. So these are organisms that can impair the health of your plants, but the ground beetle is out there patrolling the garden and is eating those pests. This is especially useful around vegetable gardens. So definitely ground beetles are great to have around your vegetable garden. Now, when the ground beetle is not patrolling the garden, it seeks shelter underneath the rocks. Underneath the rocks, at the base of the rocks, it's a cool, moist environment that is just perfect for the ground beetle. Now in Ohio, one of our common ground beetles is the big-headed ground beetle. Now, this is a pretty ferocious looking creature. It can get up to 3/4 of an inch long, and it has these big pinchers. But those pinchers are not for pinching you, they're for pinching those snails, slugs, and aphids. And if you were to encounter a big-headed ground beetle, it would simply scurry away. So you don't need to fear the big-headed ground beetle, but rather be happy that it's in your garden and give it a place to live underneath the rocks. Also, the rocks can be a very attractive feature in your garden, and if you stack up lots of small rocks, leafcutter bees will sometimes nest among the cavities between the rocks. Excellent. So let's move on to the next stop in Pollinator Town. Alright, so this is our second last stop in Pollinator Town, and this is Bumble Tunnel. And Bumble Tunnel just refers to the nesting habitat of bumblebees. And one of the reasons that I think it's fun to invite bumblebees into the garden is because bumblebees have a very interesting social structure. 90% of the world's bees are solitary, and this means that the mother bee builds her nest, stocks it with pollen and nectar, lays her egg, seals up the nest, and then she's gone. But bumblebees are different. They're social. And this means that the mother bee, the queen, is going to be working with her offspring to care for additional offspring and to tend to the nest. And all of the bees in the nest have their assigned roles. So it's really neat how they're all kind of cooperating and working together for the betterment of the entire nest. The other reason that it's good to care about bumblebees is because they are some of the very best pollinators in the bee world. They have adaptations that other bees don't that enables them to be very efficient at their pollination efforts. So for instance, the bumblebee can vibrate its flight muscles very rapidly, and doing so actually generates some body heat. This means that bumblebees can be active in the early spring and the late fall when it's too cold for other bees to be out. So flowers that are blooming at those times can be pollinated by bumblebees. And if the bumblebees weren't there, neither would those flowers. Bumblebees also have large bodies and they're very strong. This means that they're able to access certain flowers that are closed up tight and that other bees can't enter. The bumblebees have no trouble opening up those flowers, getting at the pollen and nectar, and pollinating those flowers. Bumblebees also have a very interesting way of pollinating called floral constancy. This means that when it finds a patch of wildflowers, it will visit all of the flowers of one species and then move on to the next species, and so on. And this increases the chances of successful pollination, because if the pollen from flower A gets deposited on flower B, then you don't get any seed production. So bumblebees are really great. We definitely want to care for them. And when the bumblebee is looking for a place to nest, it's looking for a cavity, either above or below ground. Probably the most common place where bumblebees nest are old rodent burrows, such as a chipmunk hole or a mouse hole or a vole hole. But bumblebees will also nest at the base of grasses. As our grasses grow, those old stems die and they accumulate in a layer called thatch. This thatch layer is a protective cover, and the bees can go under there and they can build their nest, and they don't have to worry about adverse weather, they don't have to worry about predators or parasites, so it's a perfect environment for them. So if you want to encourage bumblebees nesting in your yard or garden, a good idea is to plant a native grass, like little blue stem or switchgrass. I think we have switchgrass here, or big blue stem or Indian grass. They're all great choices. The other way that the grasses help out the bumblebees is the seed from the grasses feeds the rodents, which are digging the burrows where the bumblebees also like to nest. So it's a great way to help them out. All right, wonderful. Oh yes, I have a question. That's all right.
Do all bumblebees make honey?
You know what? The bumblebees do not make honey. Yeah, it's only the honeybees that make honey. But the bumblebees do. They drink nectar both at the flowers and also at the nest. But unlike honeybees, they don't make honey at the nest. All right, cool. Well, we'll move on to our final stop in Pollinator Town.
Or just like
So if you guys are using like this amount, or look at these kind of theory, what they're so how long you can use an area when you're using stem. Any tweak.
Oh, just another curious detail about bumblebees. They have long tongues. A bumblebee tongue can be 1.5 centimeters long, which is really remarkable considering that the bumblebee body size is maybe just a couple centimeters. So this means that it can access both shallow and deep flowers and pollinate more flowers. Okay, but enough about bumblebees. So the last stop in Pollinator Town is the flats. And the flats just consist of an area of bare soil, preferably in a sunny spot. And the organisms that are going to be living in the flats are ground nesting bees. So believe it or not, 70% of our bee species actually nest underground. They will excavate the ground and they will tunnel down, and that's where they will build their nest. Two ground nesting bees that you might encounter in an urban or suburban environment are the very smooth sweat bee and the Dunning's mining bee. Now, the Dunning's mining bee is active in the springtime. It likes to visit the flowers of spring blooming shrubs and small trees like hawthorn. The very smooth sweat bee is active from spring through fall, and it visits a wide variety of flowers, but it especially likes milkweeds. Those are one of its favorites. The very smooth sweat bee also has interesting family units in that the first generation of offspring in the nest are all daughters, and they help the mom enlarge the nest, creating room for the second generation of offspring, which will consist of daughters and sons. And that first generation of daughters also helps feed the second generation. So there's a lot going on there in that little bee's nest. Now, both of these bees nest in what's called aggregations. This means that lots of nests will be right next to each other. The very smooth sweat bee in particular can have as many as 100 nests in just a square yard. So you can imagine if that was in your garden, all of the pollinator activity you would have in your garden and all of the excellent support that you would be giving to a bunch of bees. Those are the bees that you could have in a spot of ground like this. And this concludes our tour of the neighborhoods of Pollinator Town. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Is this a predator of any other insect?
No, these bees, they're not like the wasp. They're just going after pollen and nectar.
Oh.
Yeah.
So does that mean they don't sting as much?
Yeah, these bees are not aggressively defending their nests. In fact, the Dunning's mining bee is a solitary bee, so it just seals up the nest and takes off. I do not think you would have to worry about any kind of aggressive confrontations with these bees. Yeah. There are very few bees that are going to, sting you, and they almost never sting in your garden when they're visiting flowers. Like, they just have blinders on, and they're very focused on, just foraging and gathering pollen and nectar, and you could get right up close, and they would be totally oblivious to you even being there. All right, well, thanks a lot, folks. You've been a great audience, and it was really nice talking to everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Look forward to hearing you next year.
All right, great.